6 steps involved in strategic planning. Hello and welcome to this video itself, where I will walk you through the 6 steps involved in strategic planning. And so this is particularly useful if you want to know exactly what are the steps involved in strategic planning, as well as you want to have a better sense of what goes into each and every step of strategic planning itself. So let me walk you through the 6 steps involved so that you have a better understanding. Now, before we jump into strategic planning, one of the key things that you really like to think of when it talks about strategic planning, it's this is where you are and this is where you want to be. Now, in order to get from where you are to where you want to be, there is a series of steps, and how you're going to get there is essentially going to be captured in your strategic plan. Now, before you even can get started with the strategic planning process, the very first step that you would need to take, the very first step that you need to do is what we call environmental scan. Now, what exactly is environmental scan? Well, environmental scan essentially it's basically this. It's just looking at internally what is your performance of your organization internally, right? So you are looking at past results. How have you been performing? You are also looking at the profile of your staff as well as students. You are also looking at in terms of the capability and the capacity of your people, as well as you're looking at the amount of resources that you have at your disposal. So all this cumulates to the internal scan part. Now, what about the external scan? In the external scan, essentially, we are looking at 2 levels. One level, we are looking at, for example, the the competition, right? What is the competition doing? How are they performing vis-a-vis your organization? And the other aspect that we're looking at is the landscape of the industry. So in your case here, of course, you're looking at the landscape of education. What has it evolved? How has it evolved? What are some assumptions that we once had, but it's now not valid? Or what are the assumptions that we now have to embrace in order to know about how students learn, right? So that is the external scan. Now, so the environmental scanning process essentially looks at taking all this data and information internally as well as externally. And what you then do is you then do an analysis of it. Now, the analysis is what we call a SWOT analysis. Now, but there are many, many tools that you can use to do the analysis, but the one that is most widely used is what we call the SWOT analysis. Now, the SWOT analysis essentially looks at the strength and the weaknesses. That will be internal. So internally looking at, what are your strengths and what are your weaknesses. And then externally, we are looking at what are the opportunities as well as the threats that it's involved. And so, with all this information being placed into the various contexts, it kind of gives you a better understanding of where you are at. Now, once you've done that, of course, the next part really is for you to be able to review and formulate your vision, mission, and values. Now, we are going to make the assumption that you are not starting from scratch. You already have a set of vision, mission, and values. And what you're doing essentially right now is you are reviewing them. You are asking yourself, it's the vision, mission, values still valid, right? And so, in order to answer that question, you really need to look at data. You really need to look at the internal as well as the external scan to inform you if your vision, mission, and values are still valid. And of course, once you have determined that it is still valid or it needs to be reinterpreted, then you go on to the next part, which is really identifying what is the strategic thrust. Now, the easiest way to think about strategic thrust is the following. Strategic thrust essentially is the way to look at it is that if you want to get to the moon and you have a rocket, now it will Determine how fast or how efficient are you going to go to the moon, based on the number of engines on the rocket itself. So some of you might have a, three engine rocket. Some of you might have a four engine rocket. Now, in the same light, when you talk about strategic planning, you also have your what we call the engines of growth. And these engines of growth are driven by the different areas itself. And so typically in a school context, you would have at one level, you would have learning of students, you would have building of character of students. Another third area would be, say, staff, for example. And some of you might even have a fourth area, which is looking at partnership. So those are the strategic thrust, if you like. Now, and then, of course, once you have the strategic trust, the next step is to define the goals. Essentially, what you're doing here is you're taking the vision and you're breaking it down into smaller goals. And these goals are what it's you are going to work on in the next 3 years or so, right? Now, once you have the goals, the next logical step essentially is to ask yourself, how do I know when we get there, right? How do I know when we get there? And that's where you look at the various measures and targets. And this can be thought of in the way that you identify the key performance indicators to help you measure the attainment of those goals, right? And it also help you kind of establish whether are you on the right track. So say for instance, you may have like various milestones that you would want your staff to accomplish. So maybe the first milestone is like getting everyone to have a better understanding of what differentiated instruction is, what e-pedagogy is. And then stage two is to really get everyone to be equipped with those knowledge and skills. And then stage three, it's where you have your staff implementing it and designing, lesson packages, for example, right? So this is like the key milestones that you will have. Now, of course, with each KPI, you would also have the accompanying targets. So targets are usually numbers. And this is where we look at, for example, we want the percentage of teachers to be confident in using um, differentiated instruction in their teaching and learning. So we are looking at a percentage. We're looking at a percentage of, let's say, 75% as a target, because currently we are only at 40%, for example, right? So those are the targets. Now, once you have the targets, of course, the next step really is to look at, how do you formulate your strategies? And the way to guide you in terms of thinking about formulating strategies is that you want to ask yourself this question: what do we believe to be true, right? How do we see how things work? What is our belief about how things work? And that would, include the kind of frameworks and the approaches that you have. And with those frameworks and approaches, it will then guide you into understanding how to formulate your strategies. And and so with those strategies that you have come up with, it's not some random listing of items that you would do, but these strategies are essentially actions that are thought of and conceptualized and formulated in a strategic manner. And so how do you do that? That is guided by the framework itself, right? And finally, once you have all these strategies in place, the next logical step essentially is to cascade it down to the action plan levels as well as the resource plan level. And this is really where you want to be able to say that, okay, now that I've got this plan, the next phase is really for me to take action on that, right? This is where the rubber meets the road. This is where things really get implemented, right? And so that would be captured in your action plan. And once you've done that, of course, at the end of every cycle, you would do this thing called a review. And the review, it's where you would go back and ask yourself again, like, um, where are we at, right? So you go back into your environmental scan, looking at internal and external scan, and you go through the process again and again. So this essentially is the sixth step process for strategic planning. So the task that I have for you here is that, I'd like you to review your strategic planning process currently, that the one that you have. And I'd like you to review it against these 6 steps and perhaps identify, one or two things that you can improve upon in terms of your strategic planning process. Right? So once you've done that, I will see you in the next video.